In the quiet streets of Europe during the early 1930s, peace still existed, but it was a nervous peace, fragile and uncertain, like glass that could shatter at the slightest touch. Cafes were open, trains ran on time, and governments spoke the language of diplomacy, yet beneath this surface calm lay a deep and unresolved fear. The memory of the First World War was not history, it was trauma. Every city carried scars, every family remembered loss, and every political decision was haunted by the same terrifying question: what if it happens again? The First World War had ended more than a decade earlier, but its shadow stretched far into the future. Britain and France had emerged as victors, yet victory brought little satisfaction. Millions were dead, economies were shattered, and entire generations had been psychologically damaged by trench warfare, poison gas, and endless violence. Politicians who had lived through those years understood one thing clearly: another major war could destroy Europe completely. Public opinion reflected this fear. Ordinary people demanded peace, stability, and recovery, not confrontation or military adventures. The Treaty of Versailles was supposed to guarantee that peace. Instead, it became a symbol of injustice and humiliation for Germany. The treaty blamed Germany alone for the war, forced it to pay heavy reparations, stripped it of territory, and limited its army to a fraction of its former strength. For Britain and France, especially France, the treaty was seen as necessary protection against future German aggression. For Germans, it was a national disgrace. As years passed, resentment turned into anger, and anger turned into political radicalism. Germany's democratic government struggled to survive under these pressures. Hyperinflation destroyed the savings of ordinary citizens, unemployment rose sharply, and faith in democracy collapsed. In this environment of chaos and frustration, Adolf Hitler rose to prominence. He was not just a politician, he was a symbol of revenge, pride, and hope for millions of Germans who felt betrayed and humiliated. His speeches promised to tear apart the Treaty of Versailles, rebuild Germany's military, and restore the nation's lost glory. When Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, Britain and France watched carefully but cautiously. Within months, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations, the very organization meant to preserve global peace. Hitler openly rejected the restrictions of Versailles and began rebuilding the German army. Factories were converted into weapons producers, young men were trained as soldiers, and Germany slowly transformed into a militarized state. These developments alarmed many observers, yet Britain and France hesitated to act. Their hesitation was not accidental, it was shaped by fear, exhaustion, and political calculation. Britain was struggling with the effects of the Great Depression and lacked public support for military spending. France, though more directly threatened by Germany, was politically divided and deeply defensive in mindset. French leaders feared war but doubted Britain's willingness to fight alongside them. There was also a powerful belief among British politicians that Germany had been treated too harshly after World War I. Many felt that revising the Treaty of Versailles was not only fair but necessary for long-term peace. Hitler, in his early years, appeared to support this argument. He claimed he wanted equality, not conquest. He spoke of peace while quietly preparing for war. The failure of the League of Nations further weakened resistance to German aggression. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League protested but took no real action. When Italy attacked Ethiopia in 1935, sanctions were weak and ineffective. These failures demonstrated a dangerous truth: international agreements meant little without force to support them. Aggressors learned that bold actions would be met with speeches, not soldiers. Hitler understood this lesson perfectly. In 1936, he made a calculated gamble by sending German troops into the Rhineland, a region that was supposed to remain demilitarized under the Treaty of Versailles. This move directly violated international law. German generals were nervous, the army was not strong enough to face French resistance. Hitler himself later admitted that if France had responded militarily, he would have ordered a retreat. France did nothing. Britain supported France's decision to avoid confrontation. British leaders argued that Germany was merely reoccupying its own territory and that military action would be unreasonable. Behind these arguments lay the deeper fear of war and the belief that negotiation was always better than conflict. This moment became a turning point. Hitler gained confidence, while Britain and France lost credibility. The policy that later became known as appeasement was not announced formally, nor was it written into law. It emerged gradually, shaped by fear, hope, and miscalculation. The idea was simple: if Germany's reasonable demands were met, Hitler would be satisfied, and peace would be preserved. Each concession was seen as the price of stability. As the 1930s continued, this approach became more deeply rooted in British foreign policy. Politicians believed that time was on their side, that delaying war would allow Britain to strengthen its defenses. Others genuinely believed that Hitler could be controlled through diplomacy. Few fully understood the ideological nature of Nazism or the scale of Hitler's ambitions. By the late 1930s, Europe stood at a dangerous crossroads. Germany was growing stronger, more confident, and more aggressive. Britain and France, though aware of the danger, continued to choose compromise over confrontation. Peace still existed, but it was built on fragile foundations. Every agreement, every ignored violation, and every missed opportunity to act brought Europe closer to catastrophe. The shadow of the First World War had created the appeasement policy, but that same shadow was now helping to prepare the ground for the Second. What had begun as an attempt to protect peace was slowly turning into a path toward war. And the worst was yet to come. The illusion of peace. By 1937, Adolf Hitler no longer behaved like a man testing limits. He acted like a leader who believed the limits no longer existed. Germany's economy was increasingly geared toward war, its army was stronger than ever before, and its people were unified behind a powerful nationalist narrative. What appeared to the outside world as bold diplomacy was, in reality, calculated expansion. Each move was planned not to provoke immediate war, but to make war inevitable on Germany's terms. The next target was Austria. Austria was a small, independent nation, culturally close to Germany but protected by international agreements. Hitler had long believed that Austria should be part of a greater German state. In March 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border. There was no resistance. Crowds welcomed the soldiers with cheers, flags, and celebrations. Within days, Austria was absorbed into Germany in what became known as the Anschluss. Britain and France protested, but only with words. No sanctions followed, no military response was prepared. The explanation remained familiar: Austrians appeared to support union with Germany, and intervention could lead to war. For Hitler, this was another confirmation that bold action worked. He had expanded German territory without firing a shot, and Europe had accepted it. Attention soon shifted to Czechoslovakia, a new and fragile state created after World War I. Within its borders lived millions of ethnic Germans, particularly in the Sudetenland, a strategically important region rich in industry and natural defenses. Hitler claimed that these Germans were being mistreated and denied their rights. German newspapers amplified these claims, while Nazi agents encouraged unrest inside Czechoslovakia. Unlike Austria, Czechoslovakia was prepared to defend itself. It had a strong army, modern defenses, and alliances with France and the Soviet Union. On paper, Germany faced serious opposition. But alliances only mattered if they were honored. As tension grew, the fate of Czechoslovakia depended less on Prague and more on decisions made in London and Paris. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed deeply in diplomacy. He viewed himself as a peacemaker, a man who could speak directly with Hitler and resolve disputes through reason. To him, another European war would be a disaster not just for Britain, but for civilization itself. Chamberlain believed that if grievances were addressed calmly and fairly, peace could still be saved. In September 1938, Chamberlain flew to Germany to meet Hitler. It was an extraordinary act. No British Prime Minister had ever flown abroad for negotiations before. Hitler was polite but firm. He demanded that the Sudetenland be handed over to Germany. Chamberlain returned to Britain convinced that compromise was possible. He urged France to support negotiations rather than military action. The Czechoslovak government was not invited to these discussions. As talks continued, Hitler's tone hardened. He increased pressure by threatening war if his demands were not met immediately. Europe watched anxiously as newspapers printed headlines predicting catastrophe. Millions feared that war was only days away. On September 29, 1938, leaders from Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met in Munich. Czechoslovakia was excluded from the conference, despite being the country most affected by its outcome. After hours of negotiation, the Munich Agreement was signed. The Sudetenland would be given to Germany in exchange for Hitler's promise that this would be his final territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain returned to Britain holding a piece of paper signed by Hitler. He declared that the agreement guaranteed peace for our time. Crowds cheered. Church bells rang. For many ordinary people, relief outweighed doubt. War had been avoided, at least for now. But beneath the celebration lay a disturbing reality. Czechoslovakia had lost its strongest defenses and much of its industrial base. It had been sacrificed without consent. Germany, meanwhile, gained strategic advantage without paying a price. Hitler privately mocked the agreement, seeing it not as a victory for peace, but as proof of his enemy's weakness. Within months, it became clear how hollow Hitler's promises were. In March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, turning it into a German-controlled territory. This act could no longer be defended as self-determination or justice. It was pure aggression. The reaction in Britain and France was different this time. Public opinion shifted sharply. The occupation of Czechoslovakia shattered the illusion that Hitler's ambitions were limited. The appeasement policy, once seen as practical and humane, now appeared naive and dangerous. Chamberlain, though still hoping to avoid war, finally recognized that trust alone could not stop aggression. Britain and France issued guarantees to protect Poland, signaling that further expansion would not be tolerated. Rearmament accelerated, and preparations for war quietly intensified. Hitler, however, had already made his calculations. He believed Britain and France lacked the will to fight. The lessons of the past few years seemed clear: threats were empty, negotiations always favored Germany, and bold action brought success. The Munich Agreement, rather than preventing war, had convinced Hitler that his opponents would retreat again. The illusion of peace had reached its peak and was now collapsing. Europe had gained time, but at a terrible cost. The road to war was no longer hidden behind diplomacy. It lay open, unavoidable, and fast approaching. The next move would decide everything. The breaking point. By the spring of 1939, the language of diplomacy in Europe had changed. Optimism had drained away, replaced by suspicion and urgency. Governments no longer spoke about compromise or understanding, instead, they spoke about guarantees, borders, and preparation. The events of the previous months had revealed a truth that could no longer be ignored: the balance of power in Europe was shifting rapidly, and hesitation carried consequences. Germany's attention now turned eastward. Poland stood between Germany and the territories Hitler desired, and its very existence challenged his vision of expansion. Poland was not a weak or defenseless state, but it was geographically vulnerable. Its borders were difficult to protect, and its survival depended heavily on external support. Britain and France, aware of this, issued formal guarantees promising to defend Poland if its independence was threatened. These guarantees marked a clear change in tone. For the first time, Britain publicly committed itself to military action in response to German aggression. Yet behind the strong words lay uncertainty. Military coordination was incomplete, and trust between allies was fragile. Poland itself understood that help might not arrive quickly enough if war began. Hitler watched these developments closely. He was not surprised by the guarantees, nor was he intimidated by them. Instead, he searched for a way to neutralize the final obstacle to his plans: the risk of fighting a war on two fronts. Germany's experience in the previous global conflict had shown how disastrous such a situation could be. In August 1939, the world was stunned by an unexpected announcement. Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies who had publicly condemned each other for years, signed a non-aggression pact. Officially, the agreement promised peace between the two nations. Secretly, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland, once again, became a bargaining chip in the ambitions of greater powers. The pact sent shockwaves through Europe. It destroyed the hope that diplomatic pressure or strategic alliances could restrain Germany. With the Eastern threat neutralized, Hitler's path was clear. Plans for invasion were finalized, and the machinery of war was set in motion. On the morning of September 1, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland. The attack was swift, coordinated, and overwhelming. Airplanes bombed cities and supply lines, tanks advanced rapidly, and communication networks collapsed under the pressure. The speed of the assault shocked observers and left Polish defenses struggling to respond. Britain and France now faced a moment they had spent years trying to avoid. Their credibility, their alliances, and their future role in Europe were at stake. Diplomatic messages were exchanged, deadlines were issued, and final appeals were made. Germany ignored them. On September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The decision was somber, restrained, and heavy with consequence. There were no celebrations, no cheering crowds. Instead, there was silence, resignation, and fear. The Second World War had begun. Yet even after war was declared, uncertainty dominated the early months. In Western Europe, large-scale fighting did not begin immediately. Soldiers waited behind fortifications, civilians prepared for air raids that did not yet come, and governments struggled to adapt to the reality they had long delayed. This strange period of inactivity confused and frustrated many, reinforcing the sense that the world had entered unknown territory. Poland, meanwhile, fought alone. Despite brave resistance, it could not withstand the combined pressure it faced. Within weeks, its defenses collapsed, and its territory was divided according to secret agreements already made. The speed of its defeat sent a chilling message: modern warfare was faster and more destructive than anything Europe had previously experienced. The policy that had once been defended as wise and humane was now openly condemned. Appeasement was no longer debated in theory, it was judged by outcome. Critics argued that earlier firmness might have prevented catastrophe, while supporters insisted that time gained through compromise had been essential for preparation. The debate was intense, emotional, and deeply personal for those involved. Neville Chamberlain, once praised as a peacemaker, now carried the burden of failure. Though he remained in office briefly, his authority weakened rapidly. Leadership required not only hope, but resolve, and the nation demanded both. Political unity became a priority as the scale of the conflict grew clearer. Across Europe, the psychological shift was profound. The belief that war could be avoided through negotiation had collapsed. Survival now depended on production, coordination, and endurance. Factories were repurposed, civilians were mobilized, and societies began to reorganize around the demands of total war. For Germany, the early success reinforced dangerous confidence. Military victories seemed to confirm Hitler's belief in speed, surprise, and boldness. But beneath this confidence lay risks that would soon emerge. War had expanded beyond borders and treaties, it had become a test of resources, alliances, and willpower. The collapse of appeasement was not marked by a single decision or speech. It ended in motion, in marching troops, in rising smoke, and in the realization that delay had reached its limit. What remained was a world forced to confront the consequences of choices made under fear. The war that followed would reshape nations, redraw maps, and redefine power on a global scale. The period of negotiation, concession, and illusion was over. Europe had crossed the point of no return. The final judgment of appeasement, however, was still to come. Judgment after the fire. When the war spread across continents and consumed entire societies, the decisions made in the years before it were no longer political arguments, they became historical evidence. The cost of delay was now measured not in speeches or documents, but in ruined cities, displaced populations, and countless graves. As the conflict deepened, leaders, citizens, and soldiers alike began asking the same question: how had the world allowed this to happen? During the war years, criticism of earlier policies intensified. What had once been defended as realism now appeared dangerously short-sighted. The belief that aggression could be managed through patience collapsed under the weight of reality. As reports of destruction and brutality emerged, the moral dimension of earlier choices became impossible to ignore. The issue was no longer whether war could have been avoided, but whether it had been made more devastating by hesitation. Yet judgment was not immediate or simple. Some argued that compromise had bought valuable time. Industries had expanded, defenses had been strengthened, and populations had mentally prepared for sacrifice. Without that time, they claimed, resistance might have failed altogether. Others rejected this argument, pointing out that delay had strengthened the very forces that later proved so difficult to defeat. The debate became one of the most intense in modern political history. As the war ended and the scale of destruction became fully visible, the discussion shifted from blame to lessons. Governments and institutions sought to understand how international systems had failed so completely. The collapse of trust, the misuse of negotiation, and the absence of collective enforcement were studied not as abstract theories, but as warnings. One lesson stood out above all others: peace could not survive without credibility. Agreements meant little if violations carried no consequences. Diplomacy, while essential, required strength to support it. Without that balance, negotiation became a tool for manipulation rather than resolution. This realization shaped the post-war world. New institutions were created with broader authority and clearer responsibilities. Economic cooperation was encouraged to reduce the desperation that often fuels extremism. Collective security was reimagined not as idealism, but as necessity. The mistakes of the past became the foundation for new frameworks designed to prevent their repetition. Public memory also evolved. The image of leaders returning with signed promises lost its innocence. Caution replaced optimism in how such moments were remembered. Future generations were taught to question not only intentions, but outcomes. Good faith alone was no longer considered sufficient in international relations. For individuals who had lived through both the hope and the catastrophe, the emotional weight was immense. Many carried guilt, believing that silence or trust had contributed to disaster. Others carried bitterness, convinced that early resistance could have changed history. These feelings shaped literature, film, and public discourse for decades, ensuring that the period was not forgotten or simplified. The concept that emerged from this reflection was not a rejection of peace, but a redefinition of it. Peace was no longer seen as the absence of conflict, but as the presence of stability, justice, and accountability. Avoiding confrontation at any cost was recognized as a strategy that could, paradoxically, invite greater violence. In later crises around the world, comparisons were inevitable. Every act of expansion, every broken promise, and every delayed response was measured against the memory of the 1930s. The phrase lesson of appeasement entered political vocabulary, often invoked as a warning against passivity. While sometimes misused, its origin remained rooted in genuine historical experience. At the same time, historians cautioned against simplistic conclusions. They emphasized context, fear, and uncertainty. Decisions were made by people shaped by recent trauma, limited information, and public pressure. Condemnation without understanding, they argued, risked replacing one mistake with another. Strength without wisdom could be as dangerous as patience without limits. The final judgment of appeasement, therefore, was complex. It was neither pure cowardice nor simple failure. It was a policy born from exhaustion, shaped by hope, and destroyed by reality. Its tragedy lay not in its intention, but in its misunderstanding of the forces it sought to control. By the mid-20th century, the world had been permanently changed. Power structures shifted, empires dissolved, and new rivalries emerged. Yet the shadow of pre-war choices remained visible. They served as a reminder that history is often shaped less by dramatic moments than by patterns of decision-making over time. In classrooms, archives, and public debates, the story continued to be revisited not to reopen wounds, but to sharpen awareness. The central question endured: how does one defend peace without surrendering to fear? No single answer emerged, but the consequences of ignoring the question were clear. The era of appeasement ended not with a declaration, but with understanding earned through suffering. It became a case study in the limits of compromise and the dangers of delay. Above all, it left behind a warning written not in theory, but in experience. The fire had passed. The judgment remained.